Very good. So let's get started. I see that we are on time. We have all of our panelists with us, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining this session. I know people are joining from all over the world. I want to start by thanking the ITU and all of the UN agencies involved in WSIS for giving us this platform to debate and exchange across continents on one of the most pressing issues of the WSIS action lines and sustainable development goals. Many workshops are happening over the next coming weeks under the gender mainstreaming track of the WSIS, and this is just the first one, so I encourage you all to join. So this event marks the first in a series of ISOA workshops themed Global Challenges Satellite Answers. And I would invite you to follow ISOA on Twitter and LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter to be informed about future events. Before we start, just a few house rules. To our speakers, if you wouldn't mind muting when you're not speaking. And to our participants, please feel free to ask questions and post your comments on the chat. You're most welcome to do that, and we will do our best to address the questions that you pose. The meeting will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on the WSIS Forum 2020 website afterwards. So, without further ado, I'm sure that our panelists and even most of the people watching know the value of education. In fact, most of us just take it for granted. But this workshop is going to focus on children, and in particular girls, who do not have that luxury. Thankfully, we have institutions like the ITU who champion and act to address gender equality issues. We have government departments like the UK Department of Foreign Aid who donate generously to development programs around the world. We also have regulators like the Communications Authority of Kenya who work to ensure that frameworks are in place to allow Kenyans to benefit from ICTs. And we have private companies like Avanti Communications who have worked hard to establish vital local partnerships and brought innovative satellite solutions into schools both across Tanzania and Kenya. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Doreen Bogdan-Martin, BDT Director of the ITU, Mercy Wanjao, Director General of the Communications Authority of Kenya, Debbie Mavis, who is the project lead for iMlango at Avanti Communications in the UK, and Ian Atfield, the Senior Education Advisor in the UK Department of Foreign Aid. Let me just comment before we get into the discussion that a few years ago, we might not have been so lucky to have so many ladies on the panel. And this time, we didn't actually do it deliberately. It's by virtue of the positions they hold. And I congratulate you all on that. And this is very inspiring, not only for me, but I'm sure for many other participants as well. It's also very fitting for the subject that we're addressing. So Doreen, if I could start with you. I know that you are very invested in this topic personally. Could you share the efforts that the ITU has undertaken to support the education of girls, and what plans do you have post-pandemic? How are you creating models to ensure projects are sustainable in the long term?
Thank you so much, Arti, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see you for what is, I think, a critical topic. Maybe if I could start first, I mean, on the point about education, I'm always inspired by the Nelson Mandela quote, so education being the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. The second point I wanted to raise, and of course it's sort of starting with the obvious, girls' education is a strategic development priority. Why? I mean, I think we all know why, but let's just remind ourselves, because better educated women tend to be healthier, participate more in the formal labor market, they earn higher incomes, marry at a later age, enable better healthcare, education for their children. And of course, all of these factors combined can help lift households and communities and nations out of poverty. So UNESCO has estimated that more than 130 million girls between the age of 6 and 17 are actually out of school. And that 15 million girls of primary school age, half of them in sub-Saharan Africa, actually never enter a classroom. And when I mention those figures, this is pre-COVID, right? So the other thing I want to mention, and again, we all know this, is that we have a digital divide, right? We have 3.6 billion people that are not connected to the internet. And when we look at that divide, we think about all of the digital divides, these divides amplify existing social, cultural, and economic inequalities, and the gender gap in global internet use is a stark example. And for us, we see that complicated gap through three different lenses: through access, through representation in the sector, and also through skills and other barriers. And on the access side, what we see, regrettably, is that the gap is widening, and the gap is largest in least developed countries. We know in terms of being online, 52% of women are not online compared to 42% of men. And the gap in internet use has been growing. It stands around 17% according to our statistics in 2019. On the representation side, we know women are underrepresented in the tech sector. And RT, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned we do have lots of women here today. A couple of years ago, a lot of us remember that famous manel when the WSIS Forum opened, and we had a lineup of, I think, 12 men. Things are looking better, but we do have a big problem in the tech sector in that women are not represented well in the tech sector, particularly in positions of leadership. So something we must work on. And of course, there's other barriers. And these barriers we're also seeing as a result of COVID. And one of the big barriers there is the lack of digital skills. So coming to your point, Arti, of course, COVID has exacerbated these inequalities, as I mentioned before. The pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities. It's exposing vulnerabilities in social, political, and economic systems, which are in turn amplifying the impacts of the pandemic. And so for us, it's more important than ever to take urgent actions to prioritize equal opportunities for women and girls. We have a number of efforts. We have our Equals Global Partnership, and of course, RT, we were thrilled to welcome ISOA to that partnership, which brings together more than 100 partners across 115 countries. And we look at it through three different pillars: through access, through skills, and also through leadership, with a cross-cutting track that looks at research. We are in the process right now of working on a new training program that really is a result of COVID. So looking at the skills side, trying to roll out more digital skills for women and girls, trying to develop some self-paced learnings, trying to do a better job of exposing role models like yourself, like Mercy, like Debbie. We need to get those role models out there, trying to promote more so women's leadership, women's entrepreneurship. So we've got this exciting training program that we're rolling out in the context of Equals. Another thing that I wanted to mention, and I think you're all familiar with this, is our Girls in ICT Day. That, I believe, is something that's also never been more important, held on the fourth Thursday of the fourth month. We use Girls in ICT Day to promote globally the opportunities of careers in the tech sector. To date, we've had celebrations in over 170 countries and have exposed hundreds and thousands of girls to the potential in the tech sector. The last thing I wanted to mention in terms of our efforts are the coding programs that we've been running. So we launched African Girls Can Code. Now we have America's Girls Can Code. And we've been bringing in girls to summer and actually year-round coding programs, trying to empower them with digital literacy, with the coding skills that they need. And what I would say was particularly, I think, rewarding for us was the week before last, we actually brought some of those girls back in Africa and asked them how they've been faring during the COVID pandemic. And what was really encouraging for us was to see how these girls, because of these programs, had then been able to help their families and their communities. When the world shifted online overnight, these young girls were actually able to share their knowledge and their skills with others to help them weather the crisis. And I think I'll pause there. Arti, thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. That's great to hear. And it's always absolutely thrilled to be working with you on all of these projects. Mercy, let me come to you. Kenya is really, it's a home of best practices. You have so many good examples of connecting rural areas, especially also with satellite, whether it's schools that we're talking about here, or even mobile banking and money transfer. But we know that there are many African countries not far away from Kenya even, who still have a long way to go. What has Kenya done differently to allow satellite systems to be enablers in your country? And what is your experience with satellite? You're on mute. Could you unmute?
Thank you very much, Artie, and good afternoon to everyone. We are absolutely delighted to be joining you here, and I really must recognize and pay tribute to the key partners who I see here from the ITU, Avanti, and ESOA. So coming to your question, indeed, Kenya has had quite a bit of history and positive experiences as far as connectivity goes. And I would want to attribute this first and foremost to very positive political sponsorship in the early years, which led to a very heavy and ambitious undertaking from a policy front. As a result of which, you find that our sector policy has continued to grow and to be revamped over time. And as a result, from November 2019, we got our new ICT policy, which very boldly recognizes that the future is going to rely on technologies. It also goes on to speak to technology neutrality. However, when it comes to connectivity in rural areas, satellite has a unique role to play. In the far-flung areas or the areas with very rugged terrain, satellite has come in to provide connectivity, and this has worked well for communities that are isolated or areas that were just not easy to reach. Like any other developing country, we do not have ubiquitous access to energy. And as a result of that, satellite coming from above then has a very unique character that we have chosen to leverage on. In the last couple of years, we did undertake a study, an empirical study to identify what the situation was like on the ground. And the outcome of that was an access gap study, which brought out the great need to bridge the digital divide. Of course, it doesn't come as a surprise now to say that while we all recognize that we have had a digital divide in the past, COVID has only served to really color it. And this exclusion can be really deep because it really paints the picture between those who are connected and those who have. Then driving it even deeper, when you look into communities, there are men, women and children, then the woman tends to find herself in a bit of a unique position because of affordability of the gadget, the multiple roles that a woman plays, and all those factors play towards access to the information society. So we did undertake a program called Education Broadband for Schools, and we're in the about 95–96% completion of phase 1, and will soon be embarking on phase 2. What enabled this is because we have another project, and this is a complementary project on digitization of the school curriculum. Because remember, when you go into schools, curriculum must be digitized in order to feed the pipes. So digitization of curriculum has been one of our key pillars in the move towards digital transformation. And I'm pleased to report that as far as digitization of secondary curriculum is concerned, we are at 100%. And the one for schools, for primary schools, we only have one class, class 6, is yet to be digitized. The rest of it is fully digitized. So when COVID came about, and the first case, the first COVID case was cited in Kenya in early March, schools were closed around 10 days thereafter. This really brought to bear the benefits of moving online, because we were able to shift all the schools that were connected online within 24 hours, because we do have an education TV channel. And this channel is the one that carries across TV and carries across radio. Of course, this meant that at the regulator, we had to issue regulatory directives to radios and TV, the broadcasters, so that they could carry this education TV channel for free as a must carry. And the children in Kenya have continued to learn in this space as a result. But going back to the education broadband project, which still remains a commitment for us, because we believe that while COVID has pushed us back into our homes, it will come to an end, and then students will be able to go back into the schools. So we continue to invest in the schools infrastructure. We did have a criteria that we adopt before we go into a school. For starters, the school must have a computer lab, so that in providing the devices, these devices can be safeguarded. It's also a requirement that there is a teacher who is trained in ICTs, and also that ICT education is offered as an examinable subject. So those were some of the core criteria that we had put in place for phase 1 before we could get in there. And we were able to provide 5 Mbps uplink, 1 Mbps downlink to 898 schools. And this has worked well. However, we have also come out with learnings from our criteria and the experience in phase 1, because what we realized that while our criteria is objective to enable safeguarding of this equipment, what it does is to then exclude other schools in other areas, because some places will just never be able to meet this kind of high criteria that we have set. The learnings that we are taking from this going into phase 2 is, while the authority cannot provide everything, including the computer lab, we have revised our stakeholder mapping and identified other stakeholders that we need to work hand in hand with, so that one will provide the computer lab. And I believe once you have a computer lab, the rest are details. The teacher will follow, and the students will also come about. So this has been our experience, and we are looking forward to going into phase 2 and see how that goes, because phase 2 will now go into even more marginalized areas because of bringing in stakeholders that would enable the provision of the computer lab, which had eliminated quite a number of schools. And we are hopeful that that will then enable us to close the gaps at 100%. Satellite continues to be one of the veritable solutions in this kind of areas. And we do have close working relationship, because even in a technology neutral space, there are areas and terrains where satellite would be the resort, the last resort that you would use in order to enable this connectivity. So I think I'll stop there and say that as we move into phase 2, we do realize the need to actually do a dipstick and examine what is the experience across boys and girls in school. Are we making an assumption that boys experience the same, this platform the same way as girls do? I suspect that perhaps that experience is different, but I wouldn't want to speak into it much because we haven't had a study, and we will be going in to do a mainstreaming just to evaluate what that experience is. I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Mercy, thank you so much. In fact, your point there about the experience of girls versus boys is a good segue to go to Debbie. Debbie, you are the project lead for the iMlango program in Kenya. The program has been in place now for 6 years. Can you tell us what were its objectives, what results have you seen, and where do girls come into this?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Archie, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for inviting Avanti to today's session. Yeah, we had 6 clear objectives from DFID when we set out on the iMlango project. We're in a consortium, so we have partners that come along with us. We provide the satellite connectivity. So obviously to improve the educational outcome of to reach 55,000 marginalised girls in Kenya was our first, our sort of at the outset. To ensure that we reach those girls and to improve the teachers' capability, because understandably teachers aren't used to just ICT labs, etc. So helping the teachers improve their capability. as well as the learning, but to actually raise sort of self-awareness and their career aspirations for marginalised girls. So there is a world outside of, you know, what they know and what they see every day. So that was a very important part for us. And also to, certainly from an ICT, as Doreen said, to get them really very used to this sort of ICT world, but also be able to deliver real-time analysis and output from what these sort of the children were learning. That's what we set out to do. I'm delighted, and I've been privileged to look after this iMlango project only for the last 2 years we've been involved. I've been involved for the 6 years. We've reached 78,000 marginalised girls across 245 schools, primary schools and secondary schools in Kenya. We've seen a marked increase of, if the girls can have 30 minutes to 60 minutes per week in the ICT lab with this tailored, individualised learning, that they're going to log in, it moves at their own pace. By doing that we've seen about an 18-month learning age increase every year. So every 12 months we're seeing a learning age increase by 18 months. The teachers have increased their capability too. We've had very positive feedback from teachers alike as well. So yeah, overall, really very pleased.
Brilliant, thank you, Debbie. Let me move on to Ian. Ian, of course, DFID has played an instrumental role in the iMlango project. Now, as the main donor for the Girls Education Challenge, of which iMlango is one of your flagship programs, how satisfied has DFID been with the satellite solution, and has the program met your objectives?
Great, and thank you, Ati, to inviting me, and quite happy to be the sole male member of the panel. That's no problem for me. It's great to have so many intelligent and articulate women with me today. So, I mean, just a couple of words before I directly answer your question, Ati. I mean, the UK government under Boris Johnson's leadership has been a massive supporter of girls' education and champions the right of all girls to receive 12 years of quality education. That's heavily linked into the Sustainable Development Goals that we all support. And I think that Doreen has already outlined the intergenerational benefits of supporting girls' educations, because an educated girl becomes an educated mother. There's massive improvements around child malnutrition, stopping early marriage. The list is endless. And COVID has really amplified these risks. Currently, there's predictions of children missing 0.6 years of education globally because of the current COVID lockdowns that are affecting most schools and communities. That can translate to $10 trillion in lost earnings over people's 40-50 year lifetime. This is, I'm quoting some of the World Bank global estimates. So it really is a massive issue. And of course, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, that girls and young women suffer most by the gender divide when it comes to issues such as gender-based violence, but also the digital divide. And I think, certainly where I'm usually based in South Asia, there's a real reluctance to let girls and young women use internet devices, mobile phones, etc. There's fears which come from, cultural, religious, and other factors. So certainly, I think the overall objective to increase and lessen the digital divide, both for poor people, poor countries, girls and women, is really, really important. Coming to iMlango, as you mentioned, the Girls Education Challenge has a portfolio of around 40 programs, and certainly the iMlango program is one of our flagship programs. And we really liked the fact when we started this relationship in 2013 that we were joining with a major private sector player in what we would call a strategic partnership model that's pulling together Kenyan government, UK DFID government as the funder supporter, but then the know-how, the knowledge of the private sector. And I think, we're really looking for models like iMlango that go just beyond simple corporate philanthropy or social responsibility models to models that are really trying to bring out the best that all can bring to these sorts of partnerships, the idea that we're all bringing joint and shared value. And certainly where DFID have enormous experience around education is trying to make sure that the education benefits are real, are tangible. That's why we've insisted on some really rigorous evaluation on the iMlango project. And I think that some of the information that Debbie's been sharing, which I'm sure will be made available to all on the webinar, shows some really great impact on learning outcomes, which I think is really the holy grail for all programs. I would say that learning outcomes have to be coupled together with issues of sustainability, affordability, and fitting into the education systems that are out there. I think the experience from more developed countries is that, yes, many people have been able to take up digital classrooms, online learning from home using their own ICT infrastructure, but there's still a huge problems for poor students in richer countries. I think in France, teachers lost touch of about 10% of their students within the first 3 weeks of the lockdown. These are things, you know, the realities of trying to provide education. It can't work just by some of the brilliant initiatives like the Kenya TV channel that Mercy was outlining earlier. So in a sense, what we really like about the iMlango program, as I said, is this sort of bringing together this trialing in a very brave way. This is one of the sort of riskier end programs in our spectrums because it did make such a bold upfront investment in the ICT labs, in the hardware, and obviously the satellite and digital expertise that Avanti brought. We were particularly impressed, I think, by the maths whiz and the personalized adaptive learning software. We've seen similar stuff in India going on with similar sort of software providers, where in a sense you get an ability for children to learn at their own pace. There's a great UK software called 1 Billion, which has been doing similar things and was one of the co-winners of the X Prize has worked from it in Malawi and Tanzania. So certainly those aspects have been brilliant. Elsewhere within the GEC portfolio, we've been working with Vaki and Plan International in Ghana, the Make Ghana Girls Great initiative, MG Cubed, that sort of parallels Mercy's great story from Kenya. There were videotaping lessons from master teachers and broadcasting them to remote schools in northern Nigeria. When COVID came along, Ghana TV started filming those lessons and then broadcasting them again through the Ghana TV program. And so in Kenya, the work of eKitabu has also been instrumental, and they, in partnership with the KICD, have been providing content that's not just suitable for most learners, but also includes subtitles and sign languages, so that deaf and hearing impaired students can also gain. So I think that with all of these, we're constantly learning about how the sort of niche area that satellite technology can support in education. And that's why the iMlango program that's currently entering its final year has been such a game changer. I think I would also say that, you know, that there have been some challenges. I think the upfront costs of investments are high. While it's been great, they've reached those sort of 50 to 80,000 girls in several hundred remote schools. There's still the question about how would you scale it nationally in contexts like Kenya. You have millions of schools, and obviously elsewhere in Africa, even greater levels of conflict, fragility, instability that cause problems. The rapid change in technology is the other point I would emphasize, because I think that you've seen this massive growth in the 3G phone networks, and obviously at the end point of user, they're not aware of how their data or their internet access comes. What they're aware of is something about their device and the speed. They're not aware of the backbone of the infrastructure that comes to them. And clearly some areas are now able to access other forms of internet than satellite. So I think that looking forward, this question about how do we reach the most marginalized in the most rural areas that are likely to be off some of, for example, the GSM networks for at least the next decade. The GIGA initiative, which I know is something, Doreen, that the ITU and UNICEF have been sharing on, I think also provides enormous opportunities. And to say, well, actually, if there's surplus bandwidth available from satellite providers, getting out some of these great TV and radio media broadcasts that have helped to enrich and implement some of the learning abilities. Finally, it's about sort of, I think, the role of teachers. We can't neglect teachers. We need to train teachers more broadly on internet and technology skills. It's been a massive learning curve for most teachers in European and developed countries about how to most effectively use these. The use of WhatsApp groups as a relatively simple low-tech, something that works on feature phones, has also been a growing trend that we've observed, so that you can provide printed or broadcast media and then supplement it with follow-on support from teachers and parents and community volunteers. I'll stop there, Artie. Thank you, and apologies if I've overrun.
No, that's all very interesting. And you know, what's really fascinating is that we think it's just about connectivity, but when you do a deep dive and you hear about Maths Whiz and other things, you realize, wow, the potential of what you can do and achieve with this is really phenomenal. So Doreen, can I come back to you? The notion of everything you can do with technology highlights the innovation that is required to make these kind of things happen. What innovative tools, in your view, can be used to ensure education for marginalized girls in rural areas, and how do you see satellite playing a role?
Yeah, thank you for that, Artie. And so, I mean, maybe just picking up on what you were saying, you know, connectivity is at our core in the ITU, but it's not connectivity in and of itself that's going to solve the biggest development challenges that the world faces. It's simply an enabler, right? But we have seen during this COVID pandemic how important it is to every single sector of the economy. And of course, satellite plays a very big role, especially when we're looking at rural and remote areas. And we really need to work harder with all stakeholders to get that infrastructure there and bring the connectivity to the masses, regardless of where they live, regardless of their incomes. I just wanted to pick up and thank you, Ian, for mentioning it. You know, when we think about innovation and how we're going to do this, we need to work with all partners, and really that's where we were inspired with UNICEF and other partners to launch this GIGA initiative. And of course, all of us here today, we know why we're here because of the WSIS, and we need to be reminded that actually it was the WSIS 2 phases of the summits that said we would have connected all of the world's schools by 2015, and 5 years later, we're far from that, so we failed. So GIGA was inspired by a number of things, that being one of them. And it's an ambitious effort. We want to connect all the world's schools. We want to connect every school to the internet, every young person to information, opportunity, and choice. And what we're doing is focusing on different pillars, on the mapping side, on the financing side, on the digital public good side, and of course on the empowerment side, because once you get connected, that's where the life-changing process begins. So I think GIGA is a great example and something that we're super excited about and happy that we're working with Mercy as well and the government of Kenya. The other thing I wanted to mention by way of example, and it's another way to look at how to tackle this challenge, and it's viewing it through the perspective of smart villages. So we launched this smart village effort in Niger, a country that has more of its population in rural areas than in urban areas. And we've just launched our blueprint. And what's interesting about this smart village project is it's not just about connectivity, as I noted in the beginning, it's about everything else that comes with connectivity. So it's really a cross-sectoral effort that can showcase how cost effectively we can accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. It's focused on agriculture, it's focused on health, it's focused on education, and we're looking forward to scaling. And again, picking up on Ian's point, we completely understand the importance of sustainability. So it's really those innovative approaches that we need to be considering, in particular in light of COVID. And again, Artie, to come back to your point about satellite, I mean, indeed, satellite plays a big role, and there's lots of new and exciting things happening on the satellite front that other technologies can't provide. So absolutely can be very instrumental and helpful when we look at rural and remote circumstances.
Thank you, Doreen. We are actually getting quite a few questions on. Some are from local space companies, so I'm going to make sure we get details to connect them with Avanti and Kenya. But I want to go a little bit off our agreed narrative. I think sustainability of these projects is absolutely key. And I would like to ask Ian, your funding from DFID is actually going to run out next year. I'd also like to bring in Debbie on that. What happens? Is Avanti expected to walk away from 250 schools when that funding ends? What initiatives are being taken or can be taken? And Mercy, maybe there's a role for the regulator in this. What can be done to make sure that those benefits, which have been transformational for the girls who have felt them, that we can actually carry them into the long term? Who wants to go first? Ian, maybe?
Yeah. I'll welcome start that, but great if other panelists could support me with their perspectives. I mean, sustainability, I think, is always a problematic area, and certainly within the Girls' Education Challenge, we try to build in thinking, as I'm sure Debbie can attest to, on sustainability right from the start, from project designs. And it's worth noting that the iMlango program is actually in its second phase. The Girls' Education Challenge has run in the first sort of 4-year phase up to 2016-17, and is now in the latter stages of its second phase. And certainly there's, I think, very good prospects for more funding on girls' educations from the UK government, given that we have such strong political leadership. As I think everybody knows, it's been quite turbulent times within UK for a number of reasons, not least COVID, Brexit, and recent mergers of DFID and the Foreign Commonwealth Office that was announced a couple of weeks ago. But I mean, and I think everybody is trying to sort of predict that, you know, some of the economic fallout from COVID. So this is certainly not a place to make any hard or specific promises. The smart villages idea that I think was mentioned, there's a parallel there if we look back in time a bit further to the Millennium Villages. That was a huge initiative that was set up with Jeffrey Sachs' support in the early 2000s. I've certainly had the pleasure of visiting a couple in northern Ethiopia a few years ago. And again, I mean, there's quite a strong evidence base emerging there to say that actually quite a lot of the initiatives haven't managed to sustain. And clearly the upfront investment are things that can work in specific villages and places. But if you go to ministers of finance around Africa and say, is this a strong enough evidence body to take these ideas and scale them, they would probably tell you that they're not willing at the moment. So I think that we have to get this sort of juggle right. And as I stressed in my remarks, the issue about, you know, you can look at it to say, what problem can tech or satellite connectivity or data help address? It's not, we've got some tech, now new tech, now how are we going to use it? And I think that being the sort of last mile provider of choice is one of the particular niches that satellite connectivity and some of the learning and abilities that have come from the Avanti and iMlango project have come to bite. We will certainly be working with Avanti and the other strategic partners, and of course, obviously the Kenyan government and the districts of Kenya where they work with, to try to figure out how best to sustain some of those issues. DFID's chief economist, Rachel Glenister, has a sort of has sort of internally guided us that we should be prioritizing long-term solutions, you know, making something, initiative that makes something better by 10% for 1 million girls or children is better than something that gives you a 50%, a massive improvement for just a couple of thousand. And so it's that sort of thing about instrumental and incremental gains. And I think that's going to be, you know, some of the points. And I would say it's great that we've got Mercy today on the call, because clearly we'd be saying to Kenyan government, look, you've had these major investments in getting tablets and devices around many children and schools right across Kenya. With that investment in hardware, how is that going to be sustained? And what is the connectivity, the learning software, the teacher professional development that goes with it. Kenya is globally seen as a world leader in education development. There's been some massive improvements, in particular in early grade reading, through some of the USAID support, the Primar programs. And so I think it's a really rich experimental ground, and one which the DFID World Bank Gates Education Technology Hub, I've put a link to it in the chat, is also an area. So we sort of are committed to both support the evidence and research, and certainly continue to provide some of the seed financing through these sorts of projects that generate things that can be scaled. Thanks.
So just from iMlango perspective and from Avanti, we could have done this better. I think from the start, if we had really built in sustainability from the very beginning, I think the focus was to get out there, get as much education as we could out to the girls, do as much as we could to focus on the learning outcomes. With hindsight now, we're learning, and we've started looking at sustainability. To continue with educating the girls in the 245 schools that I've mentioned, we can get that down to something like about $2 per month per child. So it's not a huge amount of money, but that's just in the 245 schools. And as Ian said, to make a real difference, we've got to get out into a much, much bigger, get right out to the community. And then that's by the time the hardware and the additional connectivity is expensive. It's more expensive, obviously, than the $2 per month. One of the things which we are now investigating, and we've spent a huge amount of time with Avanti looking at what the sustainability would be beyond, if DFID funding comes to an end next March, is what we can do and how we can look for other donors and what we can do ourselves. The schools at the moment are sort of quite discreet how they work with the ICT labs, and the children use them all day, and as much as they possibly can, use them in that way. We could do other things, get them open, as Joy mentioned, with the sort of smart villages. If we could open those schools to villages in the evenings and train older people, train adults, and open those sort of things in that way. When the children leave school, you could then have some of those children then becoming ICT teachers and helping. That would be funding coming back in to share that revenue between the children and into the school, etc. There's a huge amount of sort of ideas that we've got kind of coming through. But we certainly do need to have a much bigger conversation and trying to get, and we were talking to the ministry, etc. in Kenya. So we will, we're not going to give up easily. So we're not going to we do not intend to walk away from certainly these 245 schools that we've had the privilege to work with, and we are not going to walk away from those schools.
Thanks, Debbie. Doreen, Mercy, do you want to comment on this point of sustainability?
Yes, I'd like to comment on that, and thanks, Debbie, for assuring us that you will not walk away, because the conversation around sustainability is going to be around with us for a very long time. We know what the story usually is. When support comes and projects start off, at the point where that kind of financial funding or the support comes to an end, normally the project goes on for a short duration and then tails off and comes to an end. And this is a narrative that we really have to change for sustainability to be achieved going forward. Some of the insights and experiences that we have had, for example, are in the design of our collaborations with our partners. Because in the past, the design of the collaborations was such that there were assumptions that were inbuilt, that some kind of help would carry on for a long time to come. And this is fading away with time. And this will mean for innovation from within. The Education Act in Kenya is very prescriptive on the kind of items that parents would be required to pay for. And this does not include, for example, connectivity charges. And one of the things we are looking to is if there would be possibility to open up that to allow for those who are able to contribute and make payment towards connectivity to be able to do so, so that then the real burden would be left in spaces where it is not possible for the parents to contribute and would lead to some sort of cost sharing models. The second experience has been the realization that we cannot do it alone, and we need to reach further afield for partners to come in and provide a broad panorama of support. Because as Ian said, these kind of projects are huge. They're also very deep and capital intensive. so that we are able to really share the burden and to de-risk the projects as best as possible, and this way perhaps keep the show on the road for longer because of the various contributions that are coming from the various players. Now, with the coming of COVID, the new reality, and I think Debbie has spoken to this, is the integration of public service or community accessibility to the schools, whereas before, a school was just that. A school was a school. And what the possibility would be if you can open up the school to the community in the evening as part of the cost sharing model, which I think Debbie really spoke to that. Coming to an end is the issue of affordability of devices. I think this remains a concern across the board, that we would be able, through perhaps mass buying, to bring the cost down, and that way be able to promote access, because now we can see that while we do have devices in schools, because of the pandemic, the children are not in schools, they are at home, but unfortunately the household is not able to afford a device. So the question then becomes, what is the mechanism that in the long run would move us to a situation where a home is able to afford a device, perhaps through a long-term credit scheme or something, so that should situations like this carry on, or it becomes necessary for children to learn from home, it will be possible. As I come to an end, and speaking to the issue of sustainability, I'd also like to bring the other angle of usability and positive experiences. In the last couple of weeks, we've had an outcry in Kenya because of the high access to internet. It has led to also children accessing inappropriate content. This has been the unintended consequence, I would say, of access to ICTs. And fortunately, we have come up to put steps in place to begin to actively develop a child online protection strategy in very close collaboration with ITU, offering us technical support, because now is the time for us to actually actively put down standards of access, particularly in designated spaces in schools, and even for internet for access to homes, so that as much as possible, we are able to safeguard that true asset, the ICT platform, and to ensure that the users, particularly the minors, are able to optimize and obtain a positive experience out of that. I believe we'll be able to do that, and that will be a key driver to sustainability, because then access and acceptance will be assured. Thank you.
Arti, if I can jump in, first of all, thank you, Mercy, for raising the importance of child online protection. Certainly couldn't agree with you more. And also to just pick up on your points, and Arti, in some ways, this is kind of tied into our discussion yesterday in the context of the GSR, and there were some calls for sort of new social contract and looking at voucher systems to provide connectivity to schools and things like that. And some are sort of calling for, when we talk about the great rethink, we hear the WEF talk about it. Is it time for the great connectivity rethink? One of the things that I think is apparent is what's different now as opposed to pre-COVID is that we all understand that connectivity cannot be perceived as a luxury anymore. It is an essential digital lifeline for men, women, boys, girls, and we need to do something about that. And Ian, you referred before to the Millennium Villages. I had the pleasure of also visiting one, but I think what's different about what we're trying to do with our smart villages, and also with, of course, with Giga, is that the Millennium Villages were not constructed to think through the lens of connectivity. And so we like to think through the lens of we look at connectivity as a cross-cutter over all 17 SDGs. And so I think that was a missing component of the Millennium Villages back in that time. And of course, we've gone through all the research and we've learned quite a lot. And what we find interesting about the way we're advancing with Giga, the mapping being an essential component, but also the innovative financing models, trying to pool demand in the way that they did with Gavi when they launched Gavi to provide vaccines to the world. So try to aggregate and pool demand and then make it financially viable through that means. And then my last point on coming back to sustainability, I think we always have to remember the drivers of demand. So like, why do people want this? You know, what are their needs? And really be focused on people and their needs as the drivers for the whole conversation, because otherwise it's never going to be sustainable. And also just to note that there's lots of examples out there. And we've tried through the WSIS stock taking, of course, through our own Equals and Tech Award program to really showcase and highlight things that are working, things that are having an impact. And there's really so many great stories and examples out there that we just need to build on them and really try to scale. Thanks.
Thank you, Debbie. We only have 10 minutes left. I want to ask an important question and get your just very brief comments on it. I think, you know, we often hear about satellites being last resort for the last few percent. They have latency, this and that, you know, various things. What we are discussing here is not about 5G. And we are seeing without 5G, but with another solution, the amazing results that are being achieved by projects. Yes, they need to be scaled. Yes, they need to be made sustainable. But with a digital divide of nearly half of the world's population, why are we still talking about satellite as niche and as a last resort? Can I get your views on that? Who wants to go first?
Well, I must admit, I'll be straying out of my areas of expertise on the differentials between 4 and 5G. So I'll have a quick go. I mean, I'd just like to link to some of the other comments about whether it's niche, about the sort of sustainability, because, you know, from a user's perspective, which I'd mentioned before, you know, you've got the one approach is to provide everything through the schools and some of the financing issues that Mercy you talked about as provision, but then you've had this organic growth where consumers, even relatively poor households in Africa, have voted with their feet because they see the amazing transformation and social benefits of having certainly mobile phones, and you see them upgrading from feature phones to low-cost smartphones. And so I think that some of this thing is about just getting that balance right, to say, well, if that's provided anyway, overwhelmingly in developed nations, children and families have advised on their private connectivity and IT infrastructure. So I think the question about, you know, the complexity is, well, satellite is providing, you know, it doesn't have much of a direct association with most end users, because most end users are working with smaller phone companies, internet service providers, seeing what, you know, and we all know there's a lot of bundling in terms of, you know, trying to disguise the cost of devices or lowering the cost of devices, and having financial models where it's the connection cost or the higher purchase, you know, which is where the revenue is generating. So I think that some of the, you know, larger, to say where satellite wouldn't be niche would be to say to do satellite to government large scale deals. So you've got much cheaper rates providing large scale, you know, for example, if every school could at night when use is lower, you know, download a huge amount of video and educational and learning content, which can then be used locally at free or subsidized rates. There's certainly a zero rating policy paper I would flag on the EdTech Hub's website, which I've certainly flagged the website in the chat. That might be worth people having a look. I'm not sure it goes into depth around satellites, and that's an area that we'd welcome to explore with our experts in the Hub and with the ITU and ESOA. Thank you.
So just a word from me. So many of the schools that we reach, it's not a last resort, it's the only resort. So it's the only way that we can get connectivity into some of those schools. It needs to be fast and it needs to be consistent, and that's what satellite can do into those schools. And as much as we'd like to do things on overnight on a sort of more cost-effective basis, it's real time. So the children, because it's personalised to them and individualised, they're answering questions and being told if it's correct at that point. So it's the connectivity you need sort of immediately. But yes, I don't see it as a last resort. I think it's the only resort in many of the areas that we reach.
Thank you. Mercy, can you come in?
Yeah, coming from a public policy space that's fairly technology neutral, I would say that all the various technologies are really placed on a platform, and it's really for the provider to identify, following an assessment, what is the best placed technology to use. Of course, I say that against a background and a context, because you often start with what you already have in your hand. And Kenya has around 6,500 kilometers of national fiber optic cable, for example, which is a preferred choice of carriage, particularly for public service, for government services and the like. But having said that, we all do recognize that there are certain areas and certain character qualities that present themselves as more favorable for satellite, for example, against others. And this would obviously then open up the space for satellite, particularly in the far-flung areas like Debbie has spoken into. But we remain technology neutral and do not exercise preference one over the other, but the characteristics on the ground lend themselves in certain directions.
Thanks, Mercy. We see that there's usually a right answer. Where you have fiber, the right answer is to use it. Where you don't, that's not the right answer. Satellite can be. Thank you.
Correct.
Doreen, can I come to you again?
Yeah, thank you, RT. So, I mean, of course, I think you all know that ITU plays special attention to rural connectivity issues. We have a number of study groups. We also have a specific question where we look at telecom and ICT for rural and remote areas, where we discuss a range of technologies, public policy choices, and regulatory measures and business models. I would say for us, like, ongoing advancements in satellite networks, ground equipment, and applications have made satellite technologies an increasingly cost-effective solution, and also a critical component of telecommunications and broadband access and strategies linked to national broadband plans. And of course, particularly when we're looking at covering rural and remote areas. Again, to Mercy's point, we see a range of technologies as the solution for countries, and what we've been exploring, and RT, your team has been involved, and I think Mercy, yours as well, is a last mile connectivity toolkit. So really looking at the range of solutions, and then trying to build in this diagnostic that countries can use, look at their situations, if they have no electricity, if they're mountainous, and try to put in all of the different factors to see what's the best technology choice for the situations that they face, that they're trying to connect.
I welcome your comment. Thank you for that. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I know our WESIS colleagues would like to show a video. And as I said, this was the first of a series of sessions on gender mainstreaming. So I want to invite participants to also join the following session. I'd like to end this one by congratulating all of the panelists on what they are doing in this field, and thanking them for that. Thank you all very, very much. I'm now going to open for the video.